Welcome, viewers. Today we're examining one of the most troubling chapters of the Vietnam War era, Project 100,000, launched in 1966 by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. This program, dubbed McNamara's Morons by military personnel, lowered military entrance standards to draft approximately 350,000 men would have previously been rejected for service. With promises of training and opportunity, the Pentagon claimed this initiative would transform America's disadvantaged into productive citizens while meeting wartime personnel needs. The reality, as we'll discover, was far more devastating. Over the next few minutes, we'll examine the shocking statistics, hear from veterans who witnessed the consequences firsthand, and uncover how this failed social experiment sacrificed America's most vulnerable citizens during one of our most controversial wars. This isn't just a historical footnote, it's a sobering lesson about the human cost when military policy intersects with social engineering. Join me as we explore the tragic legacy of Project 100,000. The numbers behind Project 100,000 reveal a disturbing pattern of exploitation. Let's examine the facts. Between 1966 and 1971, approximately 350,000 men who failed to meet basic military standards were drafted through this program. These weren't volunteers seeking opportunity. They were men who previously would have been deemed unfit for service. The educational disparity is striking. 40% of these draftees hadn't completed even 9th grade, compared to just 9% of other military personnel. A full 37% read below a 6th grade level. But perhaps most revealing is the casualty rate. Project 100,000 soldiers died at nearly twice the rate of other American troops in Vietnam. They were consistently assigned to combat roles, 83% compared to 62% of standard recruits. The Pentagon placed our most vulnerable citizens directly in harm's way. The racial demographics tell another troubling story. While Black Americans represented 11% of the U.S. population, they made up 41% of Project 100,000 recruits. This wasn't opportunity. It was disproportionate sacrifice imposed on America's marginalized communities. These aren't just statistics. Each number represents a real person caught in a misguided social experiment disguised as opportunity. As we continue, remember that behind these figures were sons, brothers, and fathers whose lives were forever altered or ended by this tragic legacy of Project 100,000. The true impact of Project 100,000 is perhaps best understood through the words of those who witnessed it firsthand. These quotes from veterans paint a disturbing picture of how these men were treated in service. As one veteran describes, the sad thing about Project 100,000 was the way they were exploited, the way they were used. The lifers referred to them as McNamara's Morons and used them as minesweepers and point men on patrol. A lot of them couldn't even read a map or understand the skills needed to stay alive. This testimony reveals a cruel reality. Men with limited cognitive abilities were deliberately placed in the most dangerous positions, often without the skills necessary to protect themselves. Another veteran shares an equally troubling account. They would get assigned to the combat arms and be used as bullet catchers. The military does not care if a man is smart. What it cares about is if he can be trained to be violent and controllable. This chilling perspective shows how the program's subjects were dehumanized, viewed not as soldiers to be developed, but as expendable resources. These first-hand accounts cut through the bureaucratic language of opportunity and advancement to reveal the program's dark truth. Men with limited options were recruited, exploited, and sacrificed in a war that many couldn't even fully comprehend. 100,000 was sold to the American public as a path to opportunity and advancement for disadvantaged young men. Secretary McNamara promised that military service would provide education, training, and skills that would transform these men into productive citizens. Let's examine how these promises measured up against reality. The data is damning. Despite claims that Project 100,000 would uplift recruits, post-service outcomes tell a different story. These men experienced higher unemployment rates than both their civilian peers and other veterans. By 1970, 50% of Project 100,000 veterans were unemployed, a staggering figure that reveals the hollow nature of the program's promises. The promised education and training largely failed to materialize. While the military touted specialized training programs, most Project 100,000 recruits received minimal instruction before being thrust into combat roles. What training they did receive rarely translated to civilian job skills. Perhaps most tragically, these men returned home with fewer opportunities than when they left. Many came back with physical injuries and psychological trauma that further limited their prospects. The stigma of their military classification followed them into civilian life, often making them less employable than before their service. Far from creating the upward mobility McNamara promised, Project 100,000 exemplifies how vulnerable populations were exploited under the guise of opportunity. The program didn't lift these men up. It sacrificed them for military expediency while disguising this sacrifice as social. Project 100,000 was sold to the American public as a path to opportunity and advancement for disadvantaged young men. Secretary McNamara promised that military service would provide education, training, and skills that would transform these men into productive citizens. Let's examine how these promises measured up against reality. The data is damning. Despite claims that Project 100,000 would uplift recruits, post-service outcomes tell a different story. These men experienced higher unemployment rates than both their civilian peers and other veterans. By 1970, 50% of Project 100,000 veterans were unemployed, a staggering figure that reveals the hollow nature of the program's promises. The promised education and training largely failed to materialize. While the military touted specialized training programs, most Project 100,000 recruits received minimal instruction before being thrust into combat roles. What training they did receive rarely translated to civilian job skills. Perhaps most tragically, these men returned home with fewer opportunities than when they left. Many came back with physical injuries and psychological trauma that further limited their prospects. The stigma of their military classification followed them into civilian life, often making them less employable than before their service. Far from creating the upward mobility McNamara promised, Project 100,000 exemplifies how vulnerable populations were exploited under the guise of opportunity. The program didn't lift these men up. It sacrificed them for military expediency while disguising this sacrifice as social. The impact of Project 100,000 extends far beyond the Vietnam era. Its legacy continues to shape military policy, social programs, and our understanding of government responsibility toward vulnerable citizens. First, it serves as a stark warning about the dangers of militarizing social policy. By attempting to solve poverty and educational deficits through military service, the government created a program that exploited rather than uplifted. This cautionary tale reminds us that military institutions are designed for national defense, not social rehabilitation. Second, Project 100,000 exposed deep systemic inequalities in American society. The program disproportionately affected poor and minority communities, revealing how the burden of war falls heaviest on those with the fewest resources and options. This pattern continues to echo through our volunteer military today. Third, the program's failure undermined public trust in government initiatives. When officials present programs as beneficial while knowing the likely harmful outcomes, it erodes confidence in government institutions and fuels cynicism about future social programs. Perhaps most importantly, Project 100,000 raises profound ethical questions about consent and exploitation. Can truly informed consent exist when choices are limited by poverty, educational barriers, and social disadvantage? The program's dark legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, vulnerability, and responsibility. As we look back on Project 100,000, we must remember that historical analysis isn't merely academic, it's essential for preventing similar injustices in the future. By understanding this troubling chapter in American history, we can work toward policies that genuinely support our most vulnerable citizens rather than exploiting them in times of. The impact of Project 100,000 extends far beyond the Vietnam era. Its legacy continues to shape military policy, social programs, and our understanding of government responsibility toward vulnerable citizens. First, it serves as a stark warning about the dangers of militarizing social policy. By attempting to solve poverty and educational deficits through military service, the government created a program that exploited rather than uplifted. This cautionary tale reminds us that military institutions are designed for national defense, not social rehabilitation. Second, Project 100,000 exposed deep systemic inequalities in American society. The program disproportionately affected poor and minority communities, revealing how the burden of war falls heaviest on those with the fewest resources and options. This pattern continues to echo through our volunteer military today. Third, the program's failure undermined public trust in government initiatives. When officials present programs as beneficial while knowing the likely harmful outcomes, it erodes confidence in government institutions and fuels cynicism about future social programs. Perhaps most importantly, Project 100,000 raises profound ethical questions about consent and exploitation. Can truly informed consent exist when choices are limited by poverty, educational barriers, and social disadvantage? The program's dark legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, vulnerability, and responsibility. As we look back on Project 100,000, we must remember that historical analysis isn't merely academic, it's essential for preventing similar injustices in the future. By understanding this troubling chapter in American history, we can work toward policies that genuinely support our most vulnerable citizens rather than exploiting them in times. The impact of Project 100,000 extends far beyond the Vietnam era. Its legacy continues to shape military policy, social programs, and our understanding of government responsibility toward vulnerable citizens. First, it serves as a stark warning about the dangers of militarizing social policy. By attempting to solve poverty and educational deficits through military service, the government created a program that exploited rather than uplifted. This cautionary tale reminds us that military institutions are designed for national defense, not social rehabilitation. Second, Project 100,000 exposed deep systemic inequalities in American society. The program disproportionately affected poor and minority communities, revealing how the burden of war falls heaviest on those with the fewest resources and options. This pattern continues to echo through our volunteer military today. Third, the program's failure undermined public trust in government initiatives. When officials present programs as beneficial while knowing the likely harmful outcomes, it erodes confidence in government institutions and fuels cynicism about future social programs. Perhaps most importantly, Project 100,000 raises profound ethical questions about consent and exploitation. Can truly informed consent exist when choices are limited by poverty, educational barriers, and social disadvantage? The program's dark legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, vulnerability, and responsibility. As we look back on Project 100,000, we must remember that historical analysis isn't merely academic, it's essential for preventing similar injustices in the future. By understanding this troubling chapter in American history, we can work toward policies that genuinely support our most vulnerable citizens rather than exploiting them in times. Project 100,000 may be history, but its lessons remain profoundly relevant today. As we reflect on this troubling chapter, several principles emerge that should guide contemporary policy and ethical decision-making. First, we must scrutinize programs that target vulnerable populations, especially when they combine military objectives with social policy. When government initiatives claim to help disadvantaged groups while simultaneously serving institutional needs, we should examine whose interests are truly being prioritized. Second, we should question narratives that frame military service as the primary path to opportunity for marginalized communities. While military service can provide valuable skills and benefits, positioning it as the solution to systemic inequality shifts responsibility away from addressing the root causes of poverty and educational disadvantage. Third, informed consent requires genuine alternatives. When economic necessity and limited options drive enlistment decisions, we must ask whether true choice exists. Ethical recruitment demands that individuals have meaningful alternatives and full understanding of potential consequences. Fourth, we need accountability for policies that disproportionately place disadvantaged populations in harm's way. When sacrifice is not equally distributed across society, we perpetuate systems where those with the least power bear the greatest burden. Finally, this history reminds us to listen to marginalized voices. The men of Project 100,000 were largely silent in policy discussions that determined their fate. Their experiences and the experiences of those in similar positions today must be centered in conversations about military service, opportunity, and social policy. By learning from the failures of Project 100,000, we can work toward more just approaches that truly serve vulnerable populations rather than exploiting them in times of national need. Behind the statistics and policy analyses of Project 100,000 lie thousands of individual stories, real lives forever altered by this program. These personal accounts reveal the human dimension of this historical injustice. Consider James Green from rural Mississippi, who scored well below passing on the Armed Forces qualification test. With limited education and few job prospects, he was drafted under Project 100,000 in 1967. After minimal training, he was assigned to an infantry unit in Vietnam. 3 months into his deployment, he stepped on a landmine. He returned home missing both legs with a lifetime disability that his limited training provided no means to overcome. Or there's Michael Torres from the Bronx, who had undiagnosed dyslexia that caused him to fail the standard entrance exam. Recruited under Project 100,000, he was promised technical training that would translate to civilian employment. Instead, he received 8 weeks of basic training before being sent to combat. He survived physically but returned with severe PTSD that went untreated for decades, leading to substance abuse issues and chronic unemployment. William Davis from Chicago entered service through Project 100,000 after being told the military would provide him with an education. With a 5th grade reading level, he struggled through training and was assigned as a truck driver in a combat zone. He survived his tour but found that his military experience gave him no advantage in the civilian job market. They promised us skills, he later recalled. All I learned was how to duck. These stories represent thousands of others, men who were promised opportunity but received exploitation, who were told they would gain skills but were given rifles instead, who were assured a better future but often denied any future at all. By remembering these individual experiences, we honor the human cost of Project 100,000 and remind ourselves that behind every policy decision are real lives hanging in the balance. Behind the statistics and policy analyses of Project 100,000 lie thousands of individual stories, real lives forever altered by this program. These personal accounts reveal the human dimension of this historical injustice. Consider James Green from rural Mississippi, who scored well below passing on the Armed Forces qualification test. With limited education and few job prospects, he was drafted under Project 100,000 in 1967. After minimal training, he was assigned to an infantry unit in Vietnam. 3 months into his deployment, he stepped on a landmine. He returned home missing both legs with a lifetime disability that his limited training provided no means to overcome. Or there's Michael Torres from the Bronx, who had undiagnosed dyslexia that caused him to fail the standard entrance exam. Recruited under Project 100,000, he was promised technical training that would translate to civilian employment. Instead, he received 8 weeks of basic training before being sent to combat. He survived physically but returned with severe PTSD that went untreated for decades, leading to substance abuse issues and chronic unemployment. William Davis from Chicago entered service through Project 100,000 after being told the military would provide him with an education. With a 5th grade reading level, he struggled through training and was assigned as a truck driver in a combat zone. He survived his tour but found that his military experience gave him no advantage in the civilian job market. They promised us skills, he later recalled. All I learned was how to duck. These stories represent thousands of others, men who were promised opportunity but received exploitation, who were told they would gain skills but were given rifles instead, who were assured a better future but often denied any future at all. By remembering these individual experiences, we honor the human cost of Project 100,000 and remind ourselves that behind every policy decision are real lives hanging in the damning aspects of Project 100,000 becomes clear when we examine a critical alternative that was deliberately avoided, calling up the military reserves. During the Vietnam War, President Johnson made the politically calculated decision not to mobilize the National Guard and Army Reserve forces. This decision was unprecedented. In previous major conflicts, reserve units were among the first activated. Why the departure from established protocol? The answer reveals much about the social inequities of the war. Reserve and Guard units of the 1960s were predominantly filled with middle and upper class Americans, often college students and young professionals who had joined specifically to avoid the draft and combat deployment. These units had powerful political connections and influential family networks. Activating these units would have distributed the burden of war more equitably across social classes, but it would have come with significant political consequences. The families of reservists had political capital that the families of Project 100,000 recruits simply did not possess. The numbers tell the story. Of approximately 2.5 million Americans who served in Vietnam, only about 15,000 were National Guard and Reserve personnel. Meanwhile, 354,000 men who had been rejected for service due to educational deficiencies were drafted through Project 100,000. This stark disparity exposes Project 100,000 as not just a policy choice but a deliberate decision to place the war's burden on those with the least political power rather than risk angering constituencies with political influence. It wasn't that alternatives didn't exist. It was that the alternative of equitable sacrifice was rejected in favor of exploiting the vulnerable. The failure to activate reserves reveals the fundamental injustice at the heart of Project 100,000. When faced with a choice between political convenience and equitable sacrifice, the government chose to send underprepared, disadvantaged Americans into combat while protecting the privileged from similar risk.